Hello and welcome to Restore 2022. We are in the first letter of Corinthians chapter 10. This is an opportunity for us to be reading together God's word, to be growing in our confidence of Him and to be knowing Him and knowing how to worship Him. So 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Dinner parties were the major way in which first century people socialized. Typically, a dinner party was dedicated to a pagan god or goddess. And the Corinthians, especially the Christians, debated whether it was right to attend such a dinner party. The trouble was that participation in these kinds of parties symbolized eating at the pagan deity's table. And this then implied that you're coming under this deity's protection. So all chapters 8, 9, 10 and including 11:1, they deal with this subject of Christians, how they should relate to food that is sacrificed to idols. In summary, Paul permitted the eating of the meat that you bought at the marketplace under normal circumstances, when you don't make a big deal about it. But going to this pagan feast, especially in the pagan temple, for these demonic dinner parties is totally different ballgame. Paul is clear, you can't do both. It's whether communion with Christ and His people or a demonic dinner party. And perhaps some thought that they could do both because actually they were so convinced that they would stay strong and they would be exempt from giving in, really. But let's learn, Paul says, from the lessons of the people of Israel, God's people, and they still got involved with idolatry when God was so present there. They got involved with idolatry, immorality, they despised God's provision, and they grumbled. Those are the four things that Paul mentions here. And Paul is saying this because he's saying the same thing could happen to the Corinthians and even to us in the 21st century. No one is exempt. Paul uses the analogy of this cloud and rock to point out that the Israelites were bound to God by redemption and they were sustained by God's grace. And they thought that because God had done this for them, had delivered them, had provided for them, they were immune. They were strong enough, adequate to deal with the dangers of demonic worship. But they needed to walk closely with God. They needed to focus on His glory every day. As I have mentored and have spoken and even discipled different men of all ages, there is a common theme actually. The moment one thinks he is the strongest and self-confident, that becomes the moment of weakness where one gives in to temptation because they're not looking for God's way out, but rather an exposure to the sin or to the temptation so blatantly. And that's why Paul says, flee from it. Don't participate in this kind of practices because it does not contribute to the spiritual growth. The Corinthians were arguing for this right, this entitlement to attend pagan religious dinner parties. They viewed their attendance as a way of building their weaker brethren, really. But Paul responded that actually this kind of attendance was wrong. And there's two reasons he gives here. A, it was unloving. And B, it did not fit with the life that the good news of Jesus gives. Because partaking in the Lord's table, the symbolism there is great. He did not allow any relationship, anything to do with the demonic. Paul says, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ.